For this first session, we are fortunate to have Bruce Maynard talking on boosting your bottom lines by behaviour. Bruce is one of Australia's great agricultural innovators and system thinkers who shares his unique journey of implementing and inventing breakthrough land management techniques, transforming his own farm at Narromine in New South Wales. Bruce invented the no-kill cropping system, developed stress-free stockmanship, and co-invented self-herding. He travels Australia and overseas, enjoying being a passionate and impartial voice in the promotion of agroecology that increases the diversity of communities and landscapes. Bruce is featured in several books, has a YouTube channel called Regenerative Farming, and can be found on sites such as selfherding.com and stressfreestockmanship.com.au. We're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you do have any, just write them down or put them in the chat box. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to send out a survey. So they've got 6 questions. So if everyone is ready to go, I'd like to introduce Bruce Maynard to talk on boosting bottom lines by behaviour.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you everybody for attending or listening in at a later stage. So we'll jump straight into the presentation now about self-herding. So next. And just a couple of points about my background and interest. Of my passion has been natural resources for a very long time, growing up on our 4th generation farm at Narromine in New South Wales. Always it has been something that has intrigued me, the difference that people achieve from similar resources or similar infrastructure, but with the animal behaviour overlaid it, being sometimes the difference between great success or very big failures. So I won't go into my background. Paul's given a great introduction there, and thank you for that. But over time, the biggest thing, of course, is that everything's interlinked. And but one factor that overlays everything is human and animal behaviour. And so that, of anything, if we were to change our own behaviours somewhat, that changes the animals, that changes and shifts everything else. So that can be for the positive, and that's what today is about. Next, please. And so when we think about the larger outback areas, I sometimes put it to people, well, we can push on the string, but how about having tools that also help us to pull on the string? So you can see a scene here from the Murchison area of WA, where they're gathering cattle and they're following along a lead behind a ute that has been queued in. And in the right-hand background, you can still see that they've got musterers bringing in animals from the wider areas in the scrub. But once they're in, there's a reason for those animals to keep on going where they're directed to. Next. And so this all forms part of a bigger picture, in my view, which how can we use our animals to get a simultaneous benefit for ourselves as far as running businesses on the landscape, but also the landscape itself? Because in the long run, if we improve that basic resource, which is really just the soils and the vegetation, of course, then we have an opportunity to get the best of both. I never ever have subscribed to its environment or business. I believe that we can be creative to get both things at once, and that is the exciting thing that drives me a lot of the time. So our animals are actually fulfilling some landscape roles that have been lost over a period of time, because we don't have the same assemblage of large animals that we used to. So we use the tools at our disposal that we have now, and our livestock animals are just that. And like any tool, it can be used well or poorly. And this isn't a judgment on anything, it's just the reality. So by giving you the opportunity to use behaviour as an extra amplifier of what you want to do, then you've got a whole different set of possibilities. Next. And this is a fun old map from the 1920s, and I thought I'd just throw that in, and you can have a bit of fun looking at those descriptions there of the various different colours, showing some areas with some cattle, a few cattle, no cattle, and so on. But in the 1920s, if you wanted to seek a bit of an idea about what the cattle industry was doing, well, this would have been the information you might have used. But everything changes, doesn't it? But oftentimes in our industry, we do get a little bit fixed about saying, well, this is the way cattle behave, or this is the way sheep behave, right? But that is in our hands to actually guide that and change that in ways that help us. So nothing is actually very much fixed, and behaviour being the prime example of that. We can change that and adapt that and nudge that in exactly the same way as little tugboats go and push big ships around the ocean. You can actually shift a lot if you nudge it all the time. Next. So just a bit of background here to put a little bit more context about what we're talking about and where we're going. So this slide is just to express that today we'll be talking a little bit about level 3 and 4. So mostly about self-herding bits, which is the level 4, and then just a little bit also touching on the stress-free stockmanship level 3. And this is not disparaging anything that that people have done before. Don't think that. It's just a progression on, just the same as any field of knowledge keeps on building on the great strides that have been done before. Animal behaviour analysis is really, really coming along and in fact multiplying in its number of uses. And some of the things that say your parents or grandparents did, we might not do today. But that is in no way critical of what they did. You can only know what you know. So today we'll be talking about levels 3 and 4. Next, please. And so just a little slide here on level 3 and talking about stress-free stockmanships, just so we put a bit of context about the importance of how behaviour can actually help animals to do more things, or it can actually restrict them. So this slide here, the large yellow arrow, and maybe brown in some people's browsers, but the large arrow there just represents a stress. So imagine that we're talking about sheep for a moment, and they have to be shorn once a year if they're woolly sheep. Well, in that case, there is a stress. It's the recovery after that we're really critically interested in, not so much the stress itself. Any single stress can be disastrous for people as well as for animals if the people or animals don't recover from that. It's all about the recovery. So think about it, the first time if you're a kid and hopped on a roller coaster or some ride on a fun park or something similar like that. That's all about going up and having a stress on your whole body and then being relieved of that. So we can have an active role where that blue line sits. We can help animals get experiences that return them back to normal. And as they get more practiced in that, guess what? They get more resilient. So if anybody in your own lives, personally, if you reflect on that and think about, well, what actually makes me able to take a knock? Well, it's really the experiences that you've had in life, isn't it? So a great example of that would be if we were training a police horse, a fresh horse, to go in and be used in for demonstrations and stuff in the future. The very first day training that horse, we wouldn't throw down a heap of firecrackers in front of it right immediately that it's come into the stables. You would gradually build the horse's experience up for nastier and nastier things that it might encounter, so that one day when it's actually standing in a demonstration with all of the hubbub going around, it can cope with it. So those animals are able to cope with a lot because they've been given repeated experiences of returning back to normal. So that's what we can do with stress-free stockmanship with our animals, so that they can actually expand their behaviours. Next. So previous slide was level 3. Now this is talking about level 4 and self-herding today. So we've got a lot of things interconnected here. And when we start tugging on one side of the spider web, that starts to affect everything else. So with self-herding, the behaviour overlays everything, and it really affects some of the critical things that you guys might be interested in from a production point of view is principle 5 and 4 of livestock adaptability in a varied landscape, and also are they utilising all the plants that are in front of them? Just because animals have grown up in an area, maybe for generations, doesn't necessarily mean that they're using the whole of the landscape to its maximum. And in fact, the easiest way to imagine this in your mind's eye at the moment is wherever you're going out and seeing that the animals actually congregate, don't they, in parts of the areas. They don't occupy the whole landscape evenly, and that's partly because of the behaviours that get reinforced. Next. So what can you do? You can do many things with self-herding and these new techniques that affect the animal ethology, which is animal behaviour work. So the 3 pictures on the right are still photos taken from videos that you can access on the regenerative farming channel on YouTube. So because people's internet isn't as strong out in the bush and that sort of thing, we haven't actually played these videos, but you can access them there. And on the left there, the list has a number of things there to indicate the large amount of response that you can get in terms of changing the end result when we change behaviours. So when we think about things like the performance increase, well, what's actually holding animals back, and how would we ever know? When we've got extensive beef and sheep operations, it's often very hard to know whether any particular factor is having an effect on production, because we don't actually get a feedback loop quickly to us. If we're running a dairy farm, of course, you've got feedback loops that are usually about 12 hours. So anytime you change something, you soon know, and handling in those sort of circumstances tends to be more refined. So there's a lot here to be gained, and we'll go through some of that shortly. Next. Next, please. A brief slide here, and I do not expect you to read down the whole list, nor will we be asking any of the questions on these and those 6 questions that Paul has for you at the finish. But it is actually a list of the extensive tactics and tools and approaches that fit under the self-herding umbrella. It's an expanding field of work, and there are many different things we can do. So when we get to a question and answer session, or thinking about problems on your own place, think of it this way, the same way that a cook would approach a meal, that you've got heaps of different ingredients and you decide to keep on adding those as appropriate and change them. So it's not a fixed thing. If you're looking out of behavioural work for a set procedure that you apply just routinely over and over, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go and get robots. You won't be doing that with animals. In the same way that any of you that that ride horses. No, it's not just here's the instructions on how to ride a horse and away you go. It's a constant adjustment all the time. You never ever stop changing. Next, please. So whenever we're doing anything with animals, I want you to think into the future and examining strategies for yourself. Are we doing this by choice or force? Now, that's not me saying that force is necessarily inappropriate or necessarily negative. So the picture on the right is obviously a loading ramp out of a set of yards. Well, those rails there confine the animals, and that is a form of force. So entirely appropriate. Having yards themselves is in fact a type of force as such. But once again, that's appropriate, isn't it? But there are a lot of things that force alone, where we cannot impose force, become then impossible. Next, please. So when we're thinking about, okay, what can we get the animals to do by choice rather than by force? Well, then it's not as complete a situation as perhaps force provides. So if we put up a very good fence somewhere, that's essentially 100% solution for keeping keeping animals on one side or another. But if we put out an attractant station to attract the animals to an area, we may not get 100% of the animals staying there consistently, but we've got an 80-20 result for a very, very cheap intervention. And also, choice can take animals to places that you can never ever force them. So even if you won the lottery a number of times, if you have a country that's very, very rough or incised, or the topography or water sources don't allow for it, well, fences aren't an option. So how do we get the animals to utilise that landscape in a more even way? Then we adopt the choice pathway to get more of that landscape utilised by the animals. If we do nothing, that's just fine. They may be more than happy, but they will habitually continue to reuse some areas much more than others. And so averaging that out over the whole landscape gives you a bigger production increase, because you return nutrients further afield and more evenly to grow more grass and shrubs for the animals to eat in the long term, rather than it being concentrated in certain areas. Next, please. So I like to often point out that if we're talking about grazing management, up until now, it's mostly been focused upon the consumption of animals, how often animals bite and rebite on plants as being the survival of the plants. And while much of that is undoubtedly true and correct, what about the other 16 hours when the animals aren't eating? How can we affect the way they interact with the landscape, where they are, where they deposit their dung? That's where self-herding has a role, because you can get them by choice to go to places, because otherwise their familiarity will just bring them back to the same habits. Next, please. So what we're after, if we want to start to guide animals around the landscape, is not these sort of pictures, confusing signals. Do I go or do I stop, or which way do I go? We can provide actually very clear signals. Next, please. And so when you look at that picture, if we were together in the seminar, I would be asking you, well, what is that thing? And because it's a PDF, we can't actually take away the two round circles there. They're hiding what this thing actually is. The top round circle is hiding a big yellow rounded M for McDonald's. So it's actually a McDonald's restaurant. And then the bottom sign actually has a special on one of their type of burgers. So McDonald's knows how to affect human behaviours, and they know deeply the principles that work on us, and we're going to actually use those same principles to affect the behaviours of our animals. So what does McDonald's offer? Two key things: familiarity and diversity. So the McDonald's sign always gives you an indication of where where predictably you can get the things you're familiar with when you attend a McDonald's restaurant. That's why they have a clear and easily identified signal there for you to see. And then they run specials, don't they, from time to time? It's not just always the same old menu. And you might have noticed too that they don't run specials all the time, do they? They just they run specials at timing that is appropriate to keep visitation up strongly. So once again, they know behaviour really, really well. So you just reinforce behaviour when it's starting to tail off a bit, and you only reinforce it enough to keep the economics good. So McDonald's can tell us a lot about self-herding our cattle around the landscape. Next, please. Here's a signal, though. If you're unfamiliar, then a different sort of sign might really affect your consumption. Next, please. And so I will be a little bit like a broken record with this terminology of familiarity and diversity. So this slide here is a young wedge-tail eagle that researcher guy there tagged before the eagle left its nest, before it fledged and started off. So the red line there is where it flew from Perth, from home ground, all the way up to Lake Argyle, and started on March 25th, and on May 7th it arrived. And then it stayed up there for a while until November 12th, and then left and came back home to its familiar territory. And so it's quite amazing, isn't it, to think about the distances that animals can do and do travel. And we'll look on the next few slides, next please, about how this applies in all sorts of other different animals. So here's two different sets of tracks, and this is in the Orange and Bathurst area of New South Wales, and they're actually tracks from a collar put on a domestic house cat, two different cats, and see how that they have a really familiar range, and then they go on long journeys for diversity. And the one on the right has two lots of familiarity, doesn't it? And then goes and shows some really long searching out for diversity. That's something that's inbuilt in us as well as our animals, because if you think about it, right down to a cellular level, there's no perfect food for a human or a cat or anything else. You need diversity occasionally, but you want familiarity so you can get the most resources with the least amount of effort. Next, please. And so when we go and jump into the field examples, we're going to use that familiarity. We're going to breed a new type of familiarity to a new sign that we take around the landscape. So this was some work up at Kidman Springs Station, which is a government-run experiment station right up next to Victoria River Downs in the Northern Territory out from Katherine. And you can see the two maps there, week 1 on the left and week 13, of how their behaviours of how they occupy that area have been changed. And we did that by utilising what you see there on the right, which is an attractant station, and hanging from the tree there is an old cut-off fire extinguisher with a bit of chain in it and a bit of old steel paddle on the bottom there, so it's a bit of a wind chime. And so that wind chime, all that's signifying for the animals is that come to this place and there might be something rewarding. Now, I do want to make it clear, it's too expensive and too much trouble to keep on taking lollies around the landscape all the time. That's not what self-herding's about. Self-herding is about getting an addictive, habitual behaviour by these animals to come and have a look at these places, and they might get a reward. So it's the anticipation of reward which is the real driver here, not so much the reward. In the same way that it affects humans, if you think of watching people at the casinos or clubs operating poker machines, it's actually the desire or anticipation of reward rather than the reward itself, which drives their continual sitting there all day pressing the buttons. And so animals do the same, and we just start taking that around the landscape. Next, please. And on the ground, these aren't identical spots, but that's a sort of a before and after of what they were doing on Kidman Springs, the amount of material. So they were able to show quite conclusively and easily that they could take the animals essentially wherever they wanted to within that area. And you'll see there's a couple of traffic cones, witches' hats lying down on the ground. They're a key part of being a signal. If you like, they're the equivalent of the McDonald's sign for the animals, a visual one. And the previous slide that had the little cut-off fire extinguisher is kind of the equivalent of having the Mr. Whippy van going through the suburb and the music going off and all the kids ice cream in the old days. So you can have quite a big amount of impact, and the area there on the right was one of the areas that the staff had said, well, we can't attract them to those areas much at all. We rarely see them, rarely see tracks to there. One of the nicer little anecdotes was one of the researchers said, oh, look, right at the beginning, Bruce, I was very, very sceptical about this business with the using the traffic cones. I thought that was really just kind of silly, really, and it was just really about the tubs that we put out there. Until, she said, halfway through the experiment, we put the tubs in off a road in about 150 metres, and we put the traffic cones just on the road. The animals followed up to the traffic cones and took a right-hand turn, searching out for where the attractant station was. So that sort of thing becomes very convincing when you see it. But if you've trained any animals, then it becomes something that you can know you can bring out all the time. Next, please. And an example now from on high of some work we did in the Pilbara. And just to give you some context there, you can see the scale of the extent of the paddock. It went much further to the right and to the left off that picture. But that was a paddock that was continuously grazed. And along the red section there, if you'd gone out at the time we visited and started the work with the landholder, pretty much the grass was like a bowling green. But 6 years prior to us going out there to do our first work with this landholder, she'd installed a water point indicated there in an area that the grass was waist high. Her animals would all the time be on the around the river, keeping that low, but she couldn't get them to go out and feed much in that area, even though they put a water point there. So for 6 years, every year they would take out groups of animals and try and tail them out to there and place them on the water point. And even in one year, they actually kept them there overnight, only to see the animals would not stay on that area. So she was pretty much ready to rip out the water point there and give up on that project. And then she actually adopted some self-herding tools. Next, please. And here, these tracks are two individual animals from two different groups. So we'll talk about the yellow one first. So what they did was they instituted some self-herding tools, and what those were, just in general, were sight, sound, and smell triggers that were done in a familiar place with those animals. So I believe she did it for about 4 or 5 days in the yards, introducing sight, sound, and smell cues that were familiar in that context, and then they put them out on the water point, those same sight, sound, and smells, with the animals, and they tailed them out and just left them. And her report of that 30 odd that they'd taken out there, she said, I think we had 27 were definitely fixed on the water point, did not go back and join the main herd. There were still many cattle, like over 1,500 spread up and down the river. But those 27 decided to stay. So it was 27 out of 30 that decided to stay. Then this landholder, a great citizen scientist, she decided to, without telling us, just experiment with taking another group of animals and tailing them out there, just like they had done in the previous 6 years, even though there were some now animals using that water point. And they tagged one of them, and that's the green track. They didn't stay. Instead of getting in with that group of 30, she only got several that actually stayed with the others at the new water point. The majority went straight back to the river, including the one that she tagged. So the difference between getting animals to retain in a spot or them just going back to somewhere else is about making the new spot familiar as their regular place is. So next, please. This is an example from the Gascoyne and on some dune country. So you're looking right on the top of a large sand dune, probably 15 metres high or so. And the yellow pinpoints there are where the landholder took just a lick feeder. So not a feeder that delivers lick, but one of those ones that the animals have to work hard to get even just a little bit of food out of it. So he had some cattle pellets in it, and this was a cattle example. And he took them to each of those spots for 5 to 10 days in those positions to see what difference to the tracking would make. So this is the tracking of the animals before he's put the feeders out there, and in a moment we'll see the after. And one thing I should mention, if any of you are wondering, well, why is it all straight lines? Animals don't walk in straight lines, and that would, if you have had that thought, that would be very perceptive. That's only because with the GPS collars, they only respond back up to the satellite at certain intervals. So if they're pinging up to the satellite and the animal walks in a curve to somewhere else, well, whenever it pings next, there's a straight line between the two. So as long as you understand, of course, the animals aren't walking in straight lines. But now we'll see the after. Next, please. And that's what happened to the tracking of the animals after he'd done that 3-position shifting with a lick feeder that was on wheels, and so vastly different than before. And so that's changed everything about how those animals have impacted that landscape. And next, please. We'll see here, this is the ground level soon after it's been impacted. So as you can tell on this sandy dune country with lots of spinifex, the actual impact zone wasn't very large. Right in the very centre of the picture is where the feeder was sitting, but this is one of the spots. And then the biggest impact could be seen a year later. Next, please. And so here are two of the spots where the feeders had been 1 year earlier. And if you're looking across into the background and then comparing to where we've put the feeders, you can see that there's quite a different diversity of things that have been encouraged by just that one landscape intervention. And that's the deal here, that we can start to get more diversity across our landscape, and then more subtly as well, as you can imagine, not even in these pictures, is, well, the animals have been going across the landscape in different ways, so therefore they've impacted and experimented with more plants, so their diet diversity starts to go out further. So we're really driving ways to spark little increases in diversity and affect the landscape in the broad. Next, please. So a little review here, and just going through these one by one. There are 4 stages of animal behaviour analysis and ethology, and self-herding is working on the stage 4 work. Now, animal behaviours, quite equally, we can guide them by force or choice, and there's different, if you like, toolboxes there. One nor the other, not necessarily better or worse, just more appropriate at times. And so here's where choice gives you a much bigger set of tools out of that toolbox. But you're the ones in charge of when you apply it, how you apply it. And that's the great thing, that you don't have to be doing the same amount of intensity all the time to keep a behaviour up. So a little example of that is when you have a new pup and teaching it to sit. Well, it gets a lot of encouragement, maybe even some food rewards initially to get it to sit. But once it's got that behaviour, it gets less and less reinforcement from you, doesn't it? And if it's an old dog, it only occasionally will get a pat on the head for sitting, because it'll sit every time it gets asked to, because the behaviour is quite fixed. So it doesn't need to be reinforced very often. And so we're using the innate desires of familiarity and diversity to drive different visitation patterns across the landscape and retaining animals. So if you think about the diversity question, that's the desire of animals to go somewhere new, and we're feeding that when we want to take them to corners of the paddock that they haven't been visiting much before. If, however, we want to keep them for longer in a spot, well, then we make that more familiar by using our signals. We use sight, sound and smell, all of those 3 things, and emphasise too, the sound and smell are the bigger ones for the animals. For us humans, we tend to think about things we see because our brains and our whole evolution really puts a great premium on us using that sense. But the animals can smell and hear things that we are going to be always oblivious to because we just can't do it. So we'll use all of those 3 things as our tools towards getting them to recognise where we want them to go. Great thing about self-herding, it's out there working for you all the time. You can put things out in the landscape that work when you're happily in bed asleep, which is what a great reinforcer and what a great way of starting to nudge things the way you want them to without having to put a lot of effort in. And that means you've got a low investment here. This is not a set of tools that we ever imagine you spend a lot of money on, nor necessarily a lot of time. But just like riding a horse, the more good investment you put into riding your horse, then the more you are repaid with the abilities of that horse. So the applications are very, very wide, and they are continuing to increase. But there are also a huge wide range of benefits which are hand in glove with what you want to do. Whenever we are actually doing consultations about this sort of thing, we start on the basis, what do you want out of your business, landscape and social situation? That's what's important. And then let's bring some behavioural tools to the table that you might be able to use to get a better result or an even increased result for you. Next, please. So I have a great view, and I think it's so exciting. Our pastoral areas hold so much potential for great things, and I think in this time of changing climate and community expectations that can be seen as a threat, I just see it as a wonderful opportunity to actually get better results for the things that you're actually interested in out there. Self-herding really is and can be a great support for the social structure out in our rangelands and for the long-term health of them. I strongly believe the passion of the people that live in the bush is really what, in the long run, drives the health of the bush. But of course, reality and the real world is that you've still got to make a good living and an increasing standard of living as we go along to achieve those goals. Next. So if you wish to find out more details specifically on this and read it, at the selfherding.com site, there's a free PDF book that you may download. And please do that. We don't keep any of your details or anything like that when you download that. So that gives you more of an introduction. Or next, please. And this is the last slide. Or if you wish, you can have a look at some of the videos on the YouTube channel, or contact me directly if you wish to have more personalised interaction. Thank you.